I'm singing about grief, disenfranchised grief. Your grief is real. So tell me how you feel. Hi, this is Ashley Warren, and I'm not going to sing my whole presentation because I can't sing and I also can't really play harmonica well at all. So I'll just speak the rest of the time if that's okay. So my presentation is called Beyond the Grave, a closer look at disenfranchised grief. And this is for the class Trauma, Grief, and Loss Specialization 3 for spring of 2026. So what is disenfranchised grief anyway? According to the Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress, disenfranchised grief, or DG, refers to grief that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, socially supported, or that is just misunderstood or trivialized. So next, we'll talk about some examples of disenfranchised grief. Miscarriage, stillbirth, and birth trauma are all examples of disenfranchised grief. Today is Mother's Day, and I hold space for all of those individuals that may be grieving their mother experience or lack of being a mom or losing a child or losing a pregnancy or something like that. I know a lot of times I will have people in my office that don't feel like they get to grieve or their grief isn't as intense as somebody who's lost a child that they got to know because they didn't get to know their baby. But their grief is still very, very valid and real. Birth trauma, I think, is very important to include when we mention disenfranchised grief because a lot of people are told, well, you just had an unexpected C-section or your baby was in some need of assistance, but now they're okay. Like your baby got to go home. They're healthy. I think it's very important to notice that a lot of women, before they give birth, they have this idea about how magical and wonderful their birth is going to be. And if that doesn't go as planned, a lot of times there can be a lot of grief associated, and that grief deserves to be recognized. Loss of a job or career, death of a former spouse or partner. This is a big one in our field of work. Somebody losing a former spouse or partner. Just simply because of statistics, I think more than half the population experience divorce or separation of a long-term partnership, that kind of thing. So I think it's very, very important to notice that when you spend so much time with somebody, even if that marriage didn't work out or that relationship didn't last, like that kind of thing, that there will still be oftentimes a lot of grief associated if the person from that former relationship is to die. And so I think knowing how to recognize that grief when you're working with the former spouse of somebody that, or partner of somebody that dealt with that kind of loss is very important. Significant health changes. So this is a big one. People grieving who they were before their health changed or before their loved one's health changed. So there can be an array of different issues with this. Autoimmune disorders and diseases, cancer, all kinds of things that could change somebody's health conditions or their loved one's health condition, and there can be a lot of grief associated. Conditions affecting cognition of self or loved one is also another big one. So when there's onset of dementia or Alzheimer's, or even a traumatic brain injury, we need to be able to recognize that there can be grief associated when these kinds of things happen. I know that my husband had a friend growing up that got into a sawmill accident where he physically lost a majority of his brain in that incident, and was given like a 0% chance of living, but he lived, and he's actually able to walk and talk and live fairly independently, but because he's missing a huge portion of his brain and skull, his family, he lives with his family, and I think they will forever grieve who he could have been, or their expectations for his life, those kinds of things, just because he is so different now. And so I don't think that it's enough to say, well, he lived. Like, isn't that such a good thing? Because he's very different. And so it's important to recognize even those kinds of grief. Loss of someone beyond your just intermediate circle. So that might be a distant friend or coworker, or in our cases, even a client that you haven't worked with in years. There have been times that I've heard about somebody that I've worked with for years, even passing from natural causes, like that kind of thing. And there are still emotions that come up because the work that we did was so important. So I think it's important to mention that when we talk about disenfranchised grief. Mass casualty events. A lot of times these events are so publicized, and there's so much loss that often the individuals that experienced the situation or were involved, that kind of thing, they kind of get lost in all of that. So mass casualty events would be a good example of disenfranchised grief. Loss of a pet. So many times people, when they lose a pet, will say, oh, well, it was just a dog. It wasn't like your child or anything. I think it's super important to recognize that pets can hold a really, really big place in people's hearts. And so it's important when a pet dies, or somebody loses their pet, that their grief is recognized. Death of a loved one that includes some level of stigma. So this might include somebody's loved one dying while incarcerated, somebody's loved one dying by suicide or addiction, or even the loss of a partner that a person was involved with out of an affair, something like that. So something that society doesn't really recognize as acceptable, those kinds of things. Many times those types of grief get overlooked when loss occurs. Some symptoms associated with disenfranchised grief include intense feelings of sadness, despair, and loneliness, feelings of anger, fear, and guilt, feeling numb or nothing at all, difficulty concentrating, remembering things, and making decisions, changes in sleep pattern, changes in appetite, unexplained physical pain and muscle tension, a sense of shock or even disbelief, difficulty connecting with others and maintaining relationships, feeling or being isolated, feeling lack of closure, feeling stigmatized by self or others, feeling guilt or shame surrounding grief or the circumstances related to the loss. Some therapeutic modalities for treatment will include, or could include, cognitive behavioral therapy, narrative therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, or even, like I mentioned earlier, group therapy. So just to note briefly, related to disenfranchised grief and culture, it is essential when working with clients experiencing disenfranchised grief in order to provide effective and ethical treatment that clinicians consider cultural, social, and relational impacts. So why is recognizing and treating disenfranchised grief so important anyway? Well, first, it helps clients feel validated, and that's what we want to do for all of our clients, not just those experiencing grief, but even with this specific topic, validation is huge and so important, particularly with disenfranchised grief, because it's a type of grief that is often invalidated. It allows for increase of client self-awareness and self-advocacy. It helps to reduce risk of clients developing prolonged grief disorder. It also just allows for proper treatment planning, goal development, treatment modalities, and referrals or resource connection. So to provide proper treatment, goal development, and referrals when needed, those kinds of things, we need to really understand and recognize when grief is a part of what we're treating. So just to conclude, I do have a couple of questions for you. Do you use the term disenfranchised grief in sessions with clients when you recognize it may be relevant to treatment? And what are your preferred therapeutic modalities or treatment interventions when working with clients experiencing disenfranchised grief? Here are my references. And I thank you so much for taking the time to view and listen to my presentation today.